This is an instructional video on the assembly of the ThermoBlade North America 24-inch heated wiper blade. The video includes an overview of the tools necessary to complete the assembly, the parts required for the assembly of one wiper blade, and step-by-step instructions for the assembly. Where possible, tips on assembly techniques are also provided. The finished 24-inch ThermoBlade wiper should look like this. There are 4 tools needed for the assembly of the ThermoBlade wiper. They include long nose pliers, side cut pliers, butt splice crimping tool, and a continuity tester. It's important to have very sharp side cut pliers. Dull pliers crush the heating element wire during the cutting process and can leave a burr at the end of the wire. This makes it difficult to complete the assembly, which sometimes requires some very tight tolerances. You may also need a wire stripping tool in the event that you need to replace the butt splice on the end of the connector wire lead. There are 3 parts included in the frame assembly: the 24-inch wiper frame, the 24-inch plastic spline, and a 24-inch silicone rubber squeegee. Generally, the spline and squeegee will be provided already assembled in the parts package. Do not mount the spline and squeegee to the frame until instructed to do so in the following steps. There are also a number of wiring parts and connector parts required for assembly. These include 4 1.5-inch by 3/8-inch Viton shrink tubes, 2 9.25-inch by 1/8-inch Viton shrink tubes, 2 Bruco plastic end clips, 4 4.1/8-inch black heat-resistant zip ties, 1 48-inch nichrome heating element wire, 2 9.5 22-gauge black fiberglass tubes, and 1 PEI Genesis male rubber connector pre-assembled with 4-inch wire leads, male and female pins, and butt splices mounted in the leads. Generally, you will receive the spline and squeegee already assembled. In the event you do need to assemble these parts, just slide the T-shaped part of the squeegee into the slot in the spline. Sometimes the fit can be very tight. If you have trouble sliding the squeegee into the spline, you can coat the squeegee either with rubbing alcohol or windshield wiper fluid, and it will assemble easier. Wipe the excess off and the rest will evaporate. Make sure both ends are flush on the squeegee spline assembly. It's okay if the squeegee is a little shorter than the spline. However, if the squeegee is longer at either end of the spline, then center the parts. If there's still excess squeegee on either or both ends, cut the excess off with a razor knife for a nice flush edge. If the squeegee material is too long, then it is more difficult to attach the end clip to the frame and the squeegee assembly. The first step in the wiper assembly is to assemble the frame, the shrink tubes, and then insert the squeegee/spline into the frame. Start by sliding 2 of the 1.5-inch by 3/8-inch shrink tubes over one end of the frame. The first tube must slide over the 2 prongs on the first swivel and then butt up against the second larger knuckle on the frame. Note that the distance from the second prong to the large knuckle is slightly shorter than the shrink tube. Once the tube is over the second prong, push on the bottom of the frame on the shrink tube with your thumb and then snap the prong up so that the prong is totally exposed. Sometimes the second prong is too large to just slide the shrink tube over. In this case, you will need to use a pair of needle nose pliers and gently stretch the tube over the end of the second prong. Once the shrink tube is over the prong, you should be able to slide the shrink tube into place. This action should be done carefully. Stretching the shrink tube too much can split the shrink tube. Later, when heating the shrink tube with a heat gun, the tube may split all the way. If that happens, then that side of the wiper will have to be disassembled, and you will need to put a new shrink tube in place. If the shrink tube is stretched and has some white strings, that's okay. You only need to replace the shrink tube if it is stretched so far that it started to rip. Once the two short shrink tubes are in place, slide the 9 1/4 inch by 1/8 inch shrink tube underneath both short shrink tubes on the top side of the frame. Flip the frame to end to end and duplicate the addition of the two short and the one long shrink tubes on the other end. Now carefully slide the spline squeegee assembly onto the frame, taking care that none of the shrink tubes fall off. Once the spline is in place, there's no chance of the parts falling off the frame, although the spline should move back and forth fairly easily. Before proceeding, double check that the spline is inside all 8 prongs on the frame swivels. If you finish the wiper assembly and wire it and find that one of the prongs is not engaged in the spline, you'll need to almost start over by disassembling the wiper and sliding the spline into all the prongs. If this happens, you will have to discard the Bruco end clip that you pull off the frame and spline, because the mounting clip will break as you pull it off. You may also have to replace the wire leads on the connector, and some of the shrink tubes. You have now completed the first step of the frame assembly. It's time to position the frame for the second step, which is the wiring of the frame. Look at the two center holes on the side of the frame. One hole smaller than the other. Make sure the smaller hole is on the right side of the frame, facing you. When the frame is in this position, you'll also notice the manufacturer's stamp on the side of the frame to the right, just before the large knuckle. The stamp is the capitals JMK for JMac. This ensures that the final wiring on every frame is consistent. Now it's time for the second step, which is the wiring of the frame with the heating element. Slightly straighten the nichrome wire before inserting the end into the open channel in the silicone rubber squeegee. Push the nichrome wire through the channel until you have about 12 inches of slack wire on the right side. This should leave about 15 inches of slack on the left side of the frame assembly. Push very gently and slowly. The nichrome wire is very thin and can bend or bunch up easily, making it much more difficult to complete the rest of the assembly. The next step is to slide the 22 gauge fiberglass tubing over the heating wire on both ends of the wiper. To prepare the fiberglass tube, place pieces of the tubing in a box or plastic bag with some baby powder and shake the tubing vigorously. This should coat the fiberglass tubing with powder, making it possible to slide it over the wire and into the end of the silicone rubber squeegee. Before adding the fiberglass tubing to the other end of the frame, complete the assembly on the first end of the frame. This will assure that the squeegee and wiring are locked into place and will make the rest of the assembly easier. Lock the wiring, frame, and spline in place by sliding the Bruco plastic end clip over the end of the wire. Slide the square end of the clip over the wire towards the frame. Before proceeding, make sure you still have 12 inches of wire, including 4 inches of wire covered with fiberglass tubing exposed. If not, pull more slack from the other end of the wire, and then make sure that you still have 4 inches of fiberglass tubing inside the squeegee and 4 inches exposed. Feed the bare end of the heating element wire into the 1/8 inch shrink tube and gently push the wire in almost all the way. Make sure that about 4.5 inches of the fiberglass tube is inside the squeegee and the other half is exposed into the shrink tubing. When you have a small loop about the sizes shown in the photo, slide the Bruco end clip up the wire and snap it over the end of the spline. When you do this, the slanted side of the Bruco clip will be towards the frame. Then push the wire the rest of the way up the shrink tube until you have about 3/8 inch of bare wire showing near the center of the frame. If there's any excess wire, pull the wire from the other end until there's only about 3/8 inch of bare wire showing. You'll notice that there's a small notch hole at the end of each spline. The Bruco clip has a small tab that will engage in this notch. Snap the end clip in place and slide any slack on the spline to the other end of the frame. Push the squeegee as far to the left as it will go so the Bruco clip is butted up against the prong on the frame. Next, make sure that the long Viton shrink tube is pushed all the way to the right so that it's butted up against the Bruco end clip. Check again to make sure that you have about 3/8 inch of bare wire exposed at the other end of the long shrink tube near the center of the frame. Flip the wiper frame and duplicate the previous steps on the other end to secure the end clip and wiring into the shrink tube. On the second side, you should have about 3 to 4 inch of excess wire. Leave this for now in case you need some slack during the final attachment of the connector to the wiring. Now for the third step in the process, which is attaching the PEI Genesis connector to the frame wiring. Be sure to start with the side with the short wire exposed. It should be to the right. It should be on the same side of the frame as the small hole on the side of the wiper frame. Bend the lead slightly on the connector assembly and insert a wire on either side of the bar or saddle in the top of the wiper frame in the middle. All through this process, make sure that both wire leads are kept inside the frame. Push the butt splice end of the first side of the connector through the second vent hole on the top side of the wiper frame. Insert the nichrome wire into the butt splice and crimp the butt splice with your crimping tool. Make sure that the butt splice is crimped well. Tug firmly on the wire and connector lead to make sure there's a good crimp on the wire. If the butt splice flares out from the crimp, use a pair of pliers to flatten the flare so that it will fit into the shrink tube in the next step. Feed the wiring into the vent hole so that it's on the underside of the wiper frame. Position the butt splice so that it's centered on the first vent. This is important to ensure an extra secure wiring job. If the butt splice is not centered, then use your needle nose pliers to pull out slack from the other end of the nichrome wire until the butt splice is centered under the vent hole. Slip the shrink tubing over the butt splice. Extend the shrink tube slightly beyond the end of the butt splice so that it sticks out into the center chamber of the wiper frame about 1/4 inch. Now you will secure the wiring of the shrink tubing in place using the zip ties. Start with the second vent from the end of the wiper, the right hand side. Secure the zip tie over the shrink tube through the vent and on the face side of the frame. Make sure that the zip tie is on the left side of this second vent towards the center of the wiper from the end. This will put the zip tie about 3/4 of an inch to the left of the JMK stamped on this side of the frame. This will ensure that the zip tie does not interfere with the pivoting of the swivel on the prong arm of the wiper. Pull the zip tie as tightly as you can by putting your thumbnail on the base of the zip tie and pull with your needle nose pliers until the zip tie is as tight as possible. You should not be able to slide the zip tie back and forth on the frame. Attach the second zip tie in the first vent hole on the far left of the vent towards the center of the frame. Tighten the zip tie as before. Push both the secured zip ties towards the top of the frame to try to get the wire in the shrink tube as straight as possible across the top of the frame. Flip the frame over so that you can now work on the second connection. Cut off the excess nichrome wire so that there's about 3/8 of an inch of bare wire exposed. Make sure the second lead from the connector is inside the frame and push the butt splice end into the connector and out the second vent as before. Insert the bare nichrome wire into the butt splice and crimp solidly as you did on the other side. Tug firmly to make sure there's a solid connection. Push the wire connector back into the vent hole so that it's on the underside of the frame channel, as you did on the other side. Center the butt splice in the center channel as best you can. If it's a little off, don't worry, just make sure and put the zip tie over the butt splice when you do that step. Slide the shrink tubing over the butt splice until about 1/4 of an inch is exposed in the center frame channel as before. Flip the wiper so that the side with no twist ties is to the left. Then add the twist ties to the left side of the frame as you did before. This will ensure that all 4 twist ties are uniformly applied to the same side of the wiper frame. Remember to put the zip tie towards the center of the frame over the butt splice. As before, push the shrink tubing up over the center of the top of the wiper frame so that the wire run on the shrink tube is as straight as possible. Clip all 4 loose ends of the zip ties off using your side cuts. Make sure that your side cuts are turned flush to the zip tie so there is no little nub left sticking out from the zip tie clip. Your connection steps are now completed and your frame is almost done. Make sure to slide the 3/8 inch shrink tubes on both sides of the wiper frame so that they butt up against their respective knuckles. This ensures that there's an almost equal spacing on the various connections to the wiring run on the frame. Next, using a wire lead with a PEI Genesis male pin attached, test the circuit to make sure the connectors have held properly in place. It's important to do this prior to heat shrinking the tubing because the only reason for a failure is one or both of the butt splices are not secure. It's much easier to disassemble the wiper prior to the heat shrink process. If there is a failure, tug on each of the wire connector leads firmly. On the bad connections, the wire lead will pull out of the butt splice and the shrink tubing. Cut the zip ties off the frame just on the bad side. Slide the 1/8 inch shrink tube back to the end of the wiper frame so that it is against the Bruco end clip. There should be a short length of bare wire exposed. If the lead came loose from the butt splice, chances are there is enough of a hole left in the crimped butt splice to insert the wire a second time and crimp it more tightly. If not, then you will need to cut the butt splice off as close to the butt splice as possible, then strip the insulation from about 1/4 inch of the remainder of the connector wire. Then attach a new butt splice and crimp to the connector wire lead. Then insert the bare nichrome wire into the butt splice and crimp solidly. Slide the shrink tube over the connection and add 2 new zip ties as before. You can only do this once with a connector, otherwise the wire lead will be too short and will not provide enough slack to connect the wiper to the wiring harness on the vehicle. Please save any damaged connectors in return for rework. Now you're ready to heat shrink the tubing for the final step on the frame. Start with your heat gun at the very end of the wiper frame and work your way toward the middle of the frame. Shrink both the 3/8 inch and the 1/8 inch shrink tubes along the run. Apply extra heat to the zip tie near the end of the wiper frame so that the shrink tube will shrink underneath the zip tie. Work your way to the middle of the frame. You may need to apply some heat to the underside of the wiper frame on the shrink tube inside the frame channel near the middle of the frame. Do this by angling the wiper frame channel towards the heat gun source. Be careful not to put the spline or the heat gun against the spline, as either of these can melt. If you're wearing thick gloves, you can flip the frame immediately and shrink the other end. Or if you're doing frames in batches of 10, by the time you finish heating the 10th frame, the first one should be cool enough to hold in your bare hands to shrink the other end of the frame, the shrink tubes. Your finished heat treatment should result in a neat look with the shrink tubes completely tight to the wiring assembly. If the wiring run is not straight looking down the frame, you may still be able to push it to the center with your thumb. You now have a finished, functional 24-inch heated wiper which is ready for packaging and shipment.